Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next edition of the special webinar series that we have here at the Center for Professional Selling at Ball State University. I am your host, Deva Rangarajan. And as I said earlier, this is something where we are looking at how the COVID pandemic is changing the way salespeople need to interact with their customers and what sales management should be looking at. And while we do this, one part of what we do actually is that we try to take a look at what academic research in the past has done on these topics to shed light on how firms should be reacting now. And while I was out there looking at older academic articles that could actually help practitioners today, I came across this wonderful article in 2015 by a set of very high profile authors where they talk about business to business buying and what could it present in terms of challenges and opportunities for sales firms. And one of the authors is Professor Murali Mantrala, who I reached out to and has kindly consented to actually share some of his insights about what was the reason behind why they wrote that piece, what were some of the findings, especially as it pertains to what does it mean for the marketing and sales functions in organizations. And hopefully, I would really like to ask him what this would mean now moving forward in terms of how to deal with your marketing and sales organization and dealing with your customers. So, Dr. Mantrala, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Well, thank you, Deva, for wanting to talk to me. And I've seen some of your other discussions are very interesting. So I hope that we can have a good, engaging one here. I think you were asking about the inspiration for that article that you saw, which was actually an initiative from the ISBM, the Institute for the Study of Business Markets, which is led by Gary Lillian and Rajdeep Grewal and folks at Penn State University. This was about 5 years ago, but ISBM's surveys of B2B businesses, marketing to other businesses, fundamentally highlighted the massive changes in buying behavior on the part of industrial and organizational buyers that was not only changing how buying was being done, but it was having repercussions for how selling by industrial sellers had to be done. And so I think that their survey suggested that there was a need for new thought on what were all the transformations happening in B2B buying and therefore in B2B marketing and sales. And so they had a group of people, including me, to sort of think through a few different aspects and write about them. And so that's the part that I got really interested in, because I'd already been working on this with my good friend, Professor Sonke Alberts in Germany, was the part about how B2B buying behavior changes. First of all, what was inducing them? And second, how would they impact the selling process?
Absolutely.
And all the data and surveys, we did some informal qualitative interviews ourselves, but we also looked at a lot of industry surveys. I mean, it's clear, and I think that trend is well known now, that business buyers have become much more well-informed because of the advances in technologies and various sources of data, which are assiduously being put out by the sellers and other parties. So a lot of the search part of the buying process, if you think of the buying process as, let's say, 3 or 4 stages, where you start with the search process, and then the evaluation process, and then the actual purchase negotiations, and then the post-purchase. If you think about that as a compressed buying process, clearly the search process had become much more independent of the seller, because the information sources and detail were enough for buyers to get a pretty good idea of the lay of the land and if they had some needs, what was out there. And so there were all these surveys basically saying that 60 to 70% of the buyers didn't even want to see a sales rep
Yeah.
before uh, they had advanced far along in the process. And typically, the time when in the sales cycle when buyers might consult an actual live salesperson from a supplier company would be like maybe 70% down the cycle compared to previously where the salesperson would initiate a lot of the activity. And so this uh, massive change in the buying behavior, which was happening over a number of years, in turn had implications for how sales organizations should organize themselves, which is where we really looked at what the impact of those information technologies was at different stages. And one of the things I was particularly interested in was what were the implications for sales organizations in terms of how they should organize and how should they compensate their salespeople and so forth. And one obvious conclusion, which was consistent with the trends, was that you didn't require so many outside salespeople anymore, and who did face-to-face calls, because these buyers tended to want to do much of their research on their own.
Indeed.
And so a lot of the interaction was being postponed or occurring more at an arm's length. And inevitably, that I think led to this rise of the inside sales organization in many B2B sellers. And that has been documented quite well by various associations and surveys. But what was less studied was, well, what does it actually mean in terms of how do you set up an inside sales force and how do you organize it? So this whole idea of an inside sales force basically is about not having to meet them face to face, because those meetings used to happen more at a seller driven pace, and buyers wanted their independence. But still, buyers were not completely independent. They needed information, but at a much more advanced and higher level than before. And so the usual inside salespeople, which were like customer service reps and so on, were really not competent to provide the kind of high-level advanced information which buyers were seeking at a late stage in the selling process.
Indeed.
When they weren't interested in knowing what was out there and prices, but they were interested in knowing, what would you do for us?
Indeed.
And how will you come up with a solution, and how will we relate and work together in future? Those kind of questions were not the above the pay grade of the traditional customer service rep. But an inside sales force today, therefore, is not just a glorified customer service sales force. It's actually a high-powered, well-trained, well-equipped sales force of its own, who provide critical information towards the advanced stages and towards closure of very high-ticket and expensive purchases. And that is a big change, because that was typically the outside salesperson's job. But today, many buyers are content with talking to the inside salespeople. Well, this story has been known for a few years, but what is amazing about the current situation, which you referred to, which is the COVID, the main characteristics from a sales force viewpoint of COVID implications are, A, social distancing, B, people want to minimize face-to-face meetings, C, they want to have smaller meetings, and D, people are getting more comfortable with virtual meetings. And all of that is actually, to me, an extension of a trend which was already moving ahead, even before this COVID
Indeed.
crisis.
Actually, I think it's very, very interesting that you mentioned this because we actually had a recent conversation with actually a practitioner recently. And when we were talking about the fact that, yes, there were some situations where the inside salesperson could not necessarily answer all the questions. So essentially, the things that this person was mentioning was the fact that when you're talking about multi-million dollar, multi-million euro, multi-million whatever currency we're looking at, that yes, inside salespeople can maybe open the door, but then you will still open the door, whatever it is. You see what I mean? And then it's still you need the external sales force or the field sales force to go out there and close those deals. But what is happening because of COVID was very interesting. He said, in the past, we would have companies think about a career plan for inside sales reps to move on to become field sales reps. But he said right now, because of COVID, we actually have to think backwards to actually, and if this is going to be the norm moving forward, should our field sales force now have to become familiar with the traditional ways that inside sales reps have been working in the past, which is very interesting in terms of not just in terms of the kind of people you want to recruit, but also in terms of how do we retrain those existing sales reps. And that was something that I think is very interesting that now that you mentioned this, you can draw the parallels with that. The other thing which also struck me from what you said was the idea that we have the inside sales reps increasingly dealing with these customers, but what about things like e-commerce? Because in your paper, you talk about the fact that inside sales rep is one way a sales organization can take a look at it. But I guess one of the things which I also loved about it, and you use the Ziameter example from Dow Corning, where you talk about how Ziameter went into a complete online sale.
Yeah.
But I thought that was also very inspired that it's a choice, not of course a salesperson, but a sales organization to now, because that's a fundamental change, right? Because you go in from field sales. So suddenly you're now talking about inside sales, but guess what? You're also going to have e-commerce as a platform to try and reach out. So what are your thoughts on that one? So essentially, what does this mean for the field sales force? Because you're having parts of what they were doing being chipped away.
So the prior to COVID and the social distancing issues and so forth, there was already impact on the outside salespeople's job.
Yeah.
But it's not like they're all people with like ostriches with their heads in the sand. I mean, they knew that how their buyers are behaving. So I worked with a couple of companies, not precisely B2C, B2B, but financial services firms where they were already pairing up the outside salespeople with an inside sales assistant, but who was not your simple service rep, but actually somebody who would do part of the sales cycle. And there was much more coordination being encouraged between the outside and the inside, because if an outside rep was following a lead and the buyer doesn't care, and they call up the inside rep and say, we need this, the inside rep can't say, oh, wait, I'm going to wait till I get the outside rep. He has to have, or she has to have an answer. So this coordination was already happening. And actually, the issue the company I was working with was interested in is, how do you make them share common goals, or how do you set the incentives so that they both do part of their sales, as well as make sure they don't ignore the leads or the customers coming from the other side just because they didn't initiate the sale. So, but that is one aspect, which is much more coordination. But I also think that many outside reps, as I said, today, because of COVID, remember the inside designation was because headquarters would set up these facilities for inside salespeople to sit with the telecom equipment and so on. And that was the so-called inside sales force. But today, a lot of outside reps, and I saw this face-to-face, would be sitting in their houses and virtually contacting many of their customers. So effectively, even if they're outside the corporate headquarters, they are already in some
Yes,
sense
absolutely.
behaving like inside
Sales rep, indeed.
salespeople, and they can always link in some of their inside managers. And so I think that merging is already happening,
Yeah,
but and the smart outside salespeople would realize that this is not a alternative to their life, but actually a additional channel
indeed,
through which they could enhance their productivity.
indeed.
And the inside rep is somebody who could collaborate and actually enhance their joint productivity.
Absolutely.
Um, I think that is where the training and the reorganization and the leadership has to go, which is not to make this you versus them, but actually say that you do
Indeed.
whatever the customer wants. And what you are referring to, which was the e-commerce side, I think that also requires a strategy of segmenting your customers into
Absolutely.
different levels. And I have no doubt that there is a certain size and ticket size, so to speak, which will remain very much a personal selling
Indeed.
interaction between
Yeah.
the buyers and the sellers, because the magnitude of the sale and the information and the issues that have to be negotiated are too complex for
Indeed. Indeed.
putting in an app on in an e-commerce platform.
No.
But there will be, of course, what the B2B folks call more modified rebuys or routine
Yeah.
sales, which have already got standards and which are well established
Indeed.
rules and clear products. I think those are what will shift to the e-commerce
Indeed.
platform. Really, neither the buyer nor the salesperson wants to waste time on those products.
Absolutely.
Because,
But indeed, but I think it's very interesting, right? Because they might not want to waste time on the product, but unless an organization is smart about telling the salespeople
yeah,
how this is going to change their ability, again, in terms of the KPI setting, in terms of how their incentives are going to be structured, that it could lead to chaos and it could lead to a lot of issues where your salespeople could deliberately, instead of creating value for the customers, are just going there and becoming simple order takers and not
yeah,
necessarily creating value.
yeah.
So
You got to make sure they don't derive too much incentive from selling
absolutely,
routinized.
indeed.
And you can't afford that anymore because
Eh,
the level of training and knowledge that the reps need to really deal effectively with the advanced B2B buyer requires a lot of investment. And you
indeed,
cannot have these folks spending time on routinized purchases or uh,
indeed,
everyone, they are necessary, their jobs remain, but they just have to be more intelligently deployed
indeed,
towards
indeed. And that's the
the high
interesting
end.
part. Indeed. Because I think so from my experience in the past, when we go and talk to B2B companies and I ask them the role of marketing, and I hear things like marketing is a black hole, money goes in, nothing comes out. Marketing spends all the money that we work so hard to bring in. But essentially, what you're saying is that marketing is going to play a critical role in
Oh,
going
absolutely.
back and resegmenting your markets, in going back into how we need to identify the needs of the customers and using new methods, right? So essentially you could look at social listening, you could look at essentially you have all that kind of
And
thing.
in fact, I think that a lot too much has been made of the so-called marketing and sales divide in
Yeah,
these companies because honestly, they can't afford to live like that any longer,
yeah,
given the kind of buyer they have. And much of my abiding in research interest is how do we set up incentives to have joint
deep,
goals between marketing and sales. And marketing to me is not a different person. Marketing is simply one part of the buying process.
yeah,
It has to be dealt with the more broader information and uh,
indeed,
testimonials or whatever. But ultimately, the whole sales cycle has different facets to it, and marketing and sales have to work side by side. It's not like marketing qualifies leads and then hands over to the salespeople. That sequential thing is all out of the window now. I mean,
Absolutely.
they really have to work side by side. And this divide that I am marketing your sales is, I don't want to use a strong language here, but I do believe that uh, there is really no distinction from the customer's viewpoint. The customer doesn't care.
Exactly, right?
And,
Mhm.
and similarly,
Uh,
I think the marketing sales integration, which everyone has hoped for, will necessarily happen. The sales need support from marketing, and marketing needs direction from sales to look at certain leads. And between them, that's how they'll stay competitive.
Indeed. And I love this answer because I think COVID is only going to bring them closer together because if
Yeah,
you're by,
yeah.
because what I'm reading right now, and I would like your thoughts on that, because what we're reading right now, if you take a look at McKinsey, if you take a
Yeah,
look
and
at,
costs are going to come down.
yeah,
You look at the
yeah,
positive side of this, all these travel costs and expenses, and if a buyer is willing and able to do it virtually, then much of the reason to go there is gone
indeed,
to their site.
indeed.
I mean, in the old days, it was like we have to pay obeisance to the buyer, and we
Yeah,
have to go there, and
yeah.
But if the buyers themselves don't want you coming there,
Yes,
I mean,
Indeed, right? So this is what is very interesting because for those of you who are interested that we are going to have a part two of this webinar with Dr. Mantrala where he said something which is so obvious to him because he works on it so much, but it's just something that we need to pay attention to is the fact that when we get our external sales forces and we tell them that parts of their job is going to be taken up by inside sales force, the automatic idea is that that frees up the time of the salespeople right now to go and do much more value creating opportunities with their customers, which would involve a lot more non-typical sales activities. But the question is, if a sales force has been used to a particular way of being incentivized, now how should that be changed? Because not only are you expecting newer behaviors from your salespeople, but you're also telling them that their chances to earn is going to be linked to that as against what they were used to all along. So that, for those of you interested, that's part two of this. But I want to go back to what Dr. Mantrala said. And what do you think about this, Dr. Mantrala? Is the fact that when sales and marketing today, especially the buyers don't want to necessarily see you face to face. If they want to see you, they want to do it over these kind of channels. They're doing their homework online. Don't you think that it becomes more and more important that marketing works together with sales to begin identifying those kind of customers who post COVID are going to stick to this way of buying, so that we have to have an action plan moving forward how to deal with these kind of customers? And that could even mean sometimes taking certain customers off the portfolio of your existing salespeople. So how should this be viewed by sales management?
I think very carefully.
Yes.
uh, but what I mean by that is, we're still 2 months into this crisis, basically, and we, we know what are required by lockdowns and so forth, and so people are being constrained. But I am not ready yet to presume that I know what's going to happen
Yeah.
after this thing eases, because honestly, there may be a counter movement, which is there may be much more desire to
Yeah.
actually
See.
get back and
Yeah.
have B2B type relationships.
Yeah.
Uh, After all, people are not there just for selling and buying stuff. I mean, people are
Very interesting.
there for their livelihoods. They want to meet people. They want to have relationships. They want to grow. They want to network. I mean, there are lots of reasons why I don't think it's going to be completely eliminated.
Yeah.
You know,
Indeed.
but I do think that it would be prudent on the part of sellers to kind of have a sales force which is kind of a dual purpose sales force, which can do it both ways,
Indeed.
and then identify among their customers under what controlled conditions do you want to have face-to-face meetings, and or those who basically say, no, it's fine, let's do it virtually, because I think that some people place more weight on, looking at people in the eye and trust and having that. And certainly in the end, a couple of people have to get together and sign the deal.
Yeah.
So all I'm saying is, I think that this is no longer this or that. It's like in retailing, we talk about omni-channel buyer, and here also, I think it's going to be an omni-channel B2B selling, buying and selling.
Indeed.
And companies simply should be versatile and have salespeople well trained and equipped to be able to do it either way.
Indeed.
Or at least work with someone who's doing it the other way.
Indeed. I think one of the biggest, I wouldn't say the word concerns I have actually, is that how ready is your sales management, the middle layer? Yes, top level executives very quickly say, this is the bird's eye view, this is what we want to do. Salespeople are going to grind it out at the bottom, but actually a lot of these changes that you're talking about needs to come in from sales management. And from my experience with a lot of companies in the B2B space, again, B2B is so broad, right? I'm now talking about the traditional old ways of working kind of industries.
But as a professor, I would say that students who are like MBA students, they should get over this idea that I'm going to follow a marketing career and I don't want to do anything in sales. I don't think you can escape.
Yes.
I mean, you have to,
absolutely.
You're going to have to do it virtually or physically, but the point is the customer doesn't see such distinctions.
Indeed.
And you need to present a seamless front. And any good, successful marketer should know how to talk to a customer face to face. And any good sales rep should have some idea of what, or sales manager should have some idea of what the strategy is. So, I think the integration will happen, and organizations that will be probably the bigger changes you'll see in the organization's structure.
Indeed. Well, that's all the time that we have today, Dr. Mantrala. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. Very interesting. And for those of you interested, we're going to have one more interview that will be with Dr. Mantrala, where he's going to share his insights about what does it mean if your external sales force is going through all these changes. What does it mean for how their incentives should be managed to make sure that they are being productive, effective, and efficient as well. So thank you, Dr. Mantrala, again.
Thank you, Deva.